March 1968. An American Green Beret captain stood on an airstrip in Nui Dat, South Vietnam, and openly laughed at his allies. He watched a team of Australian SAS soldiers taking hacksaws to their rifles, literally sawing off the barrels of high-precision military weapons in a dusty garage. To Americans who prided themselves on firepower and technology, it looked like insanity. The captain turned to his men and said, "Look at those idiots. They won't last a week." He was wrong. Dead wrong. Because just 6 hours later, that same American captain wasn't laughing. He was pinned down in a jungle ambush, surrounded by Viet Cong, screaming into his handset for help. And the only people coming to save him were the idiots with the sawed-off guns. But what happened next didn't just save his life. It humiliated the entire American military doctrine and forced senior officers to confront a truth they'd been suppressing for years. Australian SAS soldiers were achieving kill ratios of 1 to 500, while American units in identical terrain were averaging 1 to 12. The Viet Cong had developed completely different tactical guidance for engaging Australians versus Americans. For Americans, aggressive ambush, maximum casualties, withdraw before artillery. For Australians, avoidance, do not engage unless absolutely necessary. If contact unavoidable, break off immediately. They called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. And 6 days after that captain laughed at the sawed-off rifles. 4 of those ghosts would infiltrate through an enemy battalion, call precision artillery from inside Viet Cong lines, and rescue 118 American paratroopers who were being systematically destroyed. This is the story of how smell, sawed-off rifles, and enemy sandals created the most effective soldiers in Vietnam, and why the Pentagon classified the evidence for decades. Before we dive into why Australian SAS soldiers stopped bathing, cut their rifles in half, and moved at 100 meters per hour through enemy territory, hit that subscribe button if you want more Vietnam War stories about the tactics that actually worked, the soldiers who proved everyone wrong, and the lessons that were too embarrassing to admit. This one is absolutely wild. The smell. On March 14, 1968, an American intelligence officer stepped off a Huey helicopter at the Australian base in Nui Dat and immediately covered his nose. The smell was biological, layered, aggressive. It suggested decomposition, stagnant water, and something his brain could only categorize as advanced human neglect. The officer had spent 18 months in Vietnam. He had visited field hospitals, burning villages, mass graves. None of those experiences prepared him for what was emanating from the Australian soldiers preparing for patrol 40 meters away. His first assumption was logistics failure. His second was disciplinary breakdown. Surely no professional military would permit soldiers to reach such a state of filth voluntarily. He approached the nearest Australian lieutenant to offer assistance with hygiene supplies. The Australian's response carried an edge the American would remember for decades. "The smell is not failure, mate. It's doctrine. And it's the reason Australian soldiers come home alive while Americans come home in aluminum boxes." The American demanded explanation. What he received was an education that would shatter everything he understood about the war he'd been fighting for 18 months. Every American soldier in Vietnam received a standard field hygiene kit. Soap, deodorant, shaving cream, toothpaste, insect repellent. The United States Army considered personal cleanliness essential for discipline and morale. Clean soldiers were professional soldiers. The Viet Cong had learned to exploit it. Captured enemy fighters confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be detected by smell from over 500 meters away. The chemical signature of American hygiene products was completely alien to the jungle environment. Deodorant created scent trails lingering for hours in humid air. Insect repellent contained compounds detectable at extreme distances. American cigarettes, with their distinctive sweet Virginia tobacco, announced patrol positions to any enemy scout within a kilometer. The Australians had eliminated every marker. 2 weeks before any patrol, SAS troopers stopped using soap entirely. They abandoned deodorant, shaving cream, commercial toothpaste. They switched from American cigarettes to local tobacco or quit entirely. They ate indigenous food, including fermented fish sauce that altered body chemistry. By insertion day, they smelled exactly like the jungle itself, like rot, mud, and vegetable decay. The tactical results were documented in classified reports that American commanders found difficult to process. Viet Cong patrols routinely passed within 2 meters of concealed Australian positions without detecting anything unusual. In one verified incident from November 1967, an enemy fighter actually stepped on an Australian trooper's boot, looked down, registered nothing but jungle debris, and continued walking. The trooper did not move, did not react, did not breathe visibly. The enemy soldier never knew he had placed his foot on a human being who could have ended his life before his next heartbeat. The rifles. The American intelligence officer noticed something wrong with the Australian rifles almost immediately. The barrels were too short. The proportions were off. When he examined one closely, he discovered that someone had taken a hacksaw to a precision military weapon and removed approximately 15 centimeters from the barrel. This was not battlefield damage. This was deliberate modification performed in the Australian armory. The standard Australian service rifle was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a variant of the legendary FNFAL. It was one of the finest battle rifles ever manufactured, accurate to 400 meters, reliable in adverse conditions, respected by militaries worldwide. The Australians were destroying it, or so it appeared. They cut the barrel short. They removed the flash suppressors. They welded crude forward grips made from scrap metal or carved hardwood. The resulting weapon looked like something a desperate partisan might assemble in an occupied country, not standard equipment for elite special operations soldiers. American weapons specialists who examined these modifications were appalled. They've ruined the ballistics. They've reduced effective range by at least 60%. They've created something loud, inaccurate, and unprofessional. The Australians called it the bitch, and it was perfectly designed for the environment where it would actually be used. In the Vietnamese jungle, average visibility was between 10 and 15 meters. Not 100 meters, not 400 meters, 15 meters. A rifle accurate to 400 meters was useless when you couldn't see past 15. Worse, the full-length barrel constantly snagged on vines, bamboo, and undergrowth. Every snag required stopping, freeing the weapon, and resuming movement. Every stop created noise. Every noise could mean detection. The bitch slid through vegetation like a snake. The shortened barrel eliminated snags. The loss of long-range accuracy was irrelevant because there was no long range. And the 7.62mm round, even from a shortened barrel, delivered stopping power the American 5.56mm M16 could not match. The M16 fired a smaller, faster round, designed for accuracy at extended ranges. In the jungle at 15 meters, it had a tendency to wound rather than stop. The round passed through human tissue so quickly that fighters sometimes continued advancing for several seconds before realizing they'd been fatally hit. The 7.62mm round from the bitch did not wound at close range. It devastated. American ordnance officers wrote damning reports about Australian weapons modifications. Those reports were filed alongside recommendations to adopt Australian methods. Both were ignored. The sandals. Several Australian troopers preparing for patrol were wearing sandals. Not military boots, sandals. Specifically, sandals made from old automobile tires with straps cut from inner tubes. The American recognized them immediately. Ho Chi Minh sandals. Standard Viet Cong footwear manufactured throughout North Vietnam. Why were Australian soldiers wearing enemy footwear? The answer revealed a level of tactical sophistication that American doctrine had never contemplated. Tracking was one of the primary methods the Viet Cong used to locate and pursue enemy patrols. Every boot left distinctive impressions. American jungle boots had specific tread patterns recognizable to any experienced tracker. A Viet Cong scout who found American boot prints knew exactly what he was following. He could estimate numbers, direction of travel, and approximate time since passage. The Australians had eliminated this signature as well. By wearing captured Ho Chi Minh sandals, Australian patrols left tracks indistinguishable from Viet Cong movement. A tracker who found these prints would assume he was following friendly forces. He would not raise alarm. He would not call for ambush teams. He might even walk directly into the Australian patrol, believing he was meeting comrades. This was not the only counter-tracking technique the Australians employed. They walked in streams when possible, leaving no prints at all. They stepped on roots and rocks rather than soft earth. When crossing muddy areas, the last man in the patrol would brush out tracks using branches. The Viet Cong, who had tracked French colonial forces for years, who tracked South Vietnamese army units with ease, who tracked American patrols almost at will, could not track the Australians. The hunters found themselves unable to locate their prey. The speed. But the single most important difference, the element that drove American observers to the edge of professional fury, was movement speed. The United States military believed in speed, aggression, and firepower. These principles had won World War II. They had held Korea. They made America the dominant military power on Earth. When American Special Operations units conducted long-range reconnaissance in Vietnam, they moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day. This was considered acceptable balance between caution and urgency. The Australian SAS moved at 100 to 200 meters per hour. When the American intelligence officer first heard this figure, he assumed translation error. 100 meters per hour meant covering 1 kilometer required an entire day. A 5-kilometer mission would take nearly a week. This seemed not merely slow, but operationally absurd. The Australians offered demonstration. What the American witnessed in 30 minutes destroyed his understanding of infantry movement. 4 troopers entered jungle terrain 500 meters from the Nui Dat perimeter. The point man took a single step, placing his foot with surgical precision on ground that would support weight without compression or sound. Then the entire patrol froze. Complete stillness, not reduced movement, zero movement. They remained frozen for 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, the American watched them scanning their surroundings using only their eyes, never turning their heads. He watched them testing the air with subtle nostril movements, reading scent the way a predator reads prey. He watched their fingers make microscopic adjustments on their weapons, preparing for instant action while appearing completely inert. After 4 minutes, another step, another freeze, another 4 minutes of absolute stillness. In 30 minutes, the patrol covered approximately 50 meters. The American stood 15 meters away. He heard nothing. Not a rustle, not a snap, not a footfall. 4 armed men had moved 50 meters through dense jungle in complete silence. The tactical logic was brutal and irrefutable. American patrols moving at 2 kilometers per day created disturbances detectable from hundreds of meters, snapping branches, rustling leaves, subtle vibrations transmitted through root systems. Viet Cong listening posts were specifically trained to identify these signatures. At 100 meters per hour, no signature existed. The jungle soundscape recovered completely between movements. Birds kept singing, insects kept droning, monkeys continued their calls. 2 enemy listening posts, areas where Australians operated, sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. But slow movement provided more than concealment. It transformed Australians from prey into apex predators. Moving at 100 meters per hour, they detected enemy activity long before being detected themselves. Viet Cong patrols moving at normal speeds created exactly the disturbances Australian troopers had trained to recognize. A patrol that had spent 4 hours listening could hear an approaching enemy from extraordinary distances. The hunters became hunted without ever knowing it. This explained the impossible kill ratios, 1 to 500. The Australians weren't better marksmen or braver soldiers. They were invisible. They struck from positions no enemy expected and disappeared before effective response was possible. The test. Long Tan Province. 6 days after the American intelligence officer filed his report, a report that would be stamped, classified, and buried. American doctrine would fail so catastrophically that even institutional denial couldn't obscure the evidence. March 20th, 1968. The 173rd Airborne Brigade drew a mission in Long Tan Province. The company assigned numbered 118 paratroopers commanded by a West Point captain on his second Vietnam tour, Bronze Star holder. Considered among the brigade's most capable officers, his soldiers were experienced veterans, They carried the latest American equipment, wore standard American uniforms, maintained standard American hygiene protocols. They smelled like Americans. They moved like Americans. They would fight like Americans. An Australian SAS patrol was operating independently in the same area. 4 men led by a sergeant with 3 Vietnam tours. They had been in the jungle for 6 days already, moving at their standard pace, gathering intelligence on enemy dispositions. They wore Ho Chi Minh sandals. They carried modified rifles. They had not bathed in 17 days. The 2 forces knew of each other, but had not coordinated. The American captain had not requested coordination and saw no reason to. His company would handle the mission using American methods. What he didn't know was that the Australian patrol had already found what his company was searching for. 4 days of patient movement had brought the Australians within observation distance of a Viet Cong battalion headquarters. They had spent 31 hours in a single concealed position, watching, counting, documenting. They had identified over 200 enemy fighters. They had mapped defensive positions. They had noted the presence of a regimental command element. They had observed ammunition distribution, meal preparation, sentry rotation schedules. They had reported this intelligence through Australian channels. Somewhere in the communication system, the information was lost, delayed, or dismissed as insufficiently verified. The American company walked into the area blind. They were approaching a reinforced enemy position with 10 times their numbers, and had no idea. The Viet Cong heard them coming from over 300 meters away. The enemy battalion commander had nearly 30 minutes to prepare his reception. The ambush. The ambush detonated at 11:47 hours. Textbook L-shaped killing zone. Enemy fighters positioned along 2 converging axes opened fire simultaneously with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. 23 American soldiers fell in the first 20 seconds. The captain survived because he was positioned in the formation center rather than at point. He immediately implemented the response his training prescribed: return fire toward identified positions, call for artillery support, request helicopter gunships, organize survivors into defensive perimeter. Everything happened exactly as doctrine specified. Artillery rounds began impacting within 8 minutes. Gunships arrived within 15 minutes. The full weight of American firepower was directed at enemy positions. None of it was working. The Viet Cong were in prepared fighting positions constructed and camouflaged over weeks. They had survived American artillery for years and knew exactly how to endure it. When barrages came, they stayed low in holes designed to withstand near misses. When gunships appeared, they used jungle canopy for concealment and shifted positions through covered trenches. The Americans couldn't see their enemy. They were shooting at muzzle flashes and suspected locations, expending ammunition against targets they couldn't verify. The enemy could see them perfectly. Every few minutes, another American soldier fell to precise fire from invisible positions. By 12:30 hours, the American company had suffered over 40 casualties. Ammunition was running low. The artillery had cratered hundreds of square meters of jungle without hitting a single confirmed enemy position. The gunships had expended most of their ordnance against shadows. The captain recognized his company was being systematically dismantled by an enemy his firepower couldn't touch. The call. At 12:51 hours, the American captain made the most humiliating radio call of his career. He requested assistance from the Australian SAS patrol he had declined to coordinate with 6 days earlier. The Australian sergeant leading the patrol received the transmission and understood immediately what it meant. Allied soldiers were being eliminated less than 2 kilometers away. He could hear the firefight. He could monitor the increasingly desperate radio traffic. He could calculate approximately how long the American company could survive at current attrition rates. Standard Australian doctrine mandated avoiding decisive engagement. Inserting into an active firefight contradicted every principle of their methodology. 4 men against a reinforced battalion was suicide by any conventional analysis. But men were being slaughtered while he listened to their radio traffic. The sergeant made his decision in under a minute. His patrol would assist, but they would do it the Australian way. When the American captain learned that Australian reinforcement was moving toward him at 100 meters per hour, his response was volcanic. His men were perishing in real time. Help was less than 2 kilometers away. and that help was apparently sleepwalking through the jungle at a pace that would arrive sometime next week. He demanded the Australians move faster. The sergeant refused. He explained briefly that faster movement would result in detection, and detected reinforcement would simply add Australian casualties to the American total without changing outcome. The captain would have to hold with what he had until the Australians reached a position where they could actually make a difference. The next 93 minutes were the longest of the American captain's military career. The infiltration. What the captain couldn't see was what the Australians were actually doing. The patrol was not moving toward the American position. They were moving through the enemy position, using the firefight's noise as auditory cover, using scent discipline to avoid detection. 4 Australian soldiers were infiltrating directly through the Viet Cong rear area. The movement demanded absolute mastery of every skill Australian training had developed. They passed within meters of enemy fighters focused entirely on the American target to their front. They navigated through a battalion-sized engagement without creating any disturbance that might alert the enemy to their presence. They moved in complete silence through vegetation that should have made silence impossible. At one point, an enemy fighter moved to within arm's reach of the sergeant's position. The Australian remained frozen as the Viet Cong soldier adjusted his equipment, checked his ammunition, and returned to his fighting position. The enemy never knew that death had been one trigger pull away. At 14:27 hours, the Australian patrol reached a position no American tactical planner would have believed achievable. They were inside the Viet Cong perimeter, 35 meters from the enemy battalion command post, surrounded by over 200 fighters who had no idea they were there. The reversal. The sergeant began transmitting artillery corrections. These were not the broad area adjustments that had accomplished nothing for 2 hours. These were precision coordinates specifying individual targets with accuracy measured in meters. He could see exactly where the enemy command element was directing the battle. He could see the machine gun positions causing the heaviest American casualties. He could see the ammunition distribution points, the reinforcement routes, the prepared withdrawal paths. The first corrected mission landed directly on the Viet Cong command post. The battalion commander and his staff ceased to exist in a single devastating impact. Command and control collapsed instantly. The second correction eliminated a heavy machine gun position, responsible for roughly 40% of American casualties. The gun went silent permanently. The third correction sealed the primary enemy withdrawal route. Viet Cong fighters attempting to disengage were caught in killing zones by artillery that seemed to know their plans before execution. The fourth correction destroyed an ammunition point. Secondary explosions continued for several minutes. Within 18 minutes, the battle reversed completely. The force that had been methodically destroying an American company was now being eliminated with surgical precision. Positions that had been invisible to American observers were targeted with impossible accuracy. Escape routes were sealed before they could be used. Command structure was eliminated before orders could be issued. The surviving Viet Cong broke and fled, leaving equipment, wounded, and organizational coherence behind. The American company, which had faced annihilation, was able to consolidate and prepare for extraction. Final count: 34 Americans killed, 51 wounded out of 118 engaged. Viet Cong losses estimated at 87, eliminated with unknown additional casualties. The Australian patrol that had infiltrated the enemy perimeter and called precision fires from inside their lines suffered 0 casualties. The classification. The after-action reports were classified at the highest levels, not for operational security, for institutional protection. 4 Australians using primitive methods had accomplished what 118 elite American paratroopers with massive fire support could not. They had not merely rescued the American unit. They had demonstrated beyond denial that American doctrine was producing failure, while Australian doctrine was producing success. This was not information the Pentagon wanted circulating, but evidence kept accumulating, and the most damning evidence came from the enemy themselves. The enemy's assessment documents captured in late 1968 revealed that the Viet Cong had developed completely different tactical guidance for engaging Australian versus American forces. For Americans, American units use helicopter insertion, creating detectable noise signatures from kilometers away. American patrols move at trackable speeds, leaving clear trails. American soldiers can be smelled from 500 meters. American doctrine favors immediate escalation to heavy supporting fires, creating exploitable patterns. Recommended approach: aggressive ambush at carefully selected locations, inflict maximum casualties in first 30 seconds. Withdraw through prepared routes before artillery becomes effective. For Australians, Australian patrols extremely difficult to detect, cannot be smelled because they eliminate chemical signatures, cannot be heard because they move too slowly to create sound, cannot be tracked because their counter-tracking techniques make trail-following impossible movement patterns unpredictable. Patience exceeds anything other Western forces demonstrate. Recommended approach: avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush. Australians more likely to detect the trap before entering it. Do not attempt pursuit. If contact unavoidable, break off as quickly as possible and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols are not operating. The documents used a specific term for Australian soldiers that was applied to no other Allied force: Ma Rung, Vietnamese for jungle ghosts. The term carried supernatural connotations exceeding ordinary military respect. The Viet Cong were not merely cautious about Australian forces, they were afraid in ways they were never afraid of Americans. The statistics. The numbers told a story the Pentagon preferred to suppress. Australian SAS patrols in Phuoc Tuy province, kill ratio, approximately 1 friendly casualty for every 500 enemy eliminated American units conducting identical missions in adjacent sectors. Kill ratio, average 1 to 12. The disparity was not marginal, it was catastrophic. It suggested one approach was working while another was failing completely. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy province, where Australian forces concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. When they did enter, their behavior changed completely, becoming defensive and cautious rather than offensive and aggressive. The legacy. The American captain who made that desperate radio call survived the war. He spent his remaining months in country seeking out Australian personnel, asking questions, observing training, trying to understand what had happened that day and why his doctrine had failed so completely. He learned that his company had walked into that ambush smelling like a department store. He learned that his patrol speed had announced presence to every enemy listening post within a kilometer. He learned that every assumption underlying his tactical approach had been wrong for the environment where he was operating. He also learned that the men who saved him had been mocked as primitives by American colleagues, that their methods had been dismissed as cowardice or incompetence, that the evidence of their success had been classified and buried because it embarrassed institutions that preferred comfortable failure to uncomfortable learning. He left the Army in 1970. He never spoke publicly about what happened in Long Tan province. The records remained classified for decades. But he remembered the men who fell because American doctrine put them in positions that Australian doctrine would have avoided. The radio call begging for help from soldiers he had declined to coordinate with. The 93 minutes watching his command disintegrate while help crawled toward him at 100 meters per hour. He remembered the moment when 4 men who smelled like death emerged from the jungle, having walked through an enemy battalion without detection. The moment when artillery that had been useless for hours suddenly began landing with surgical precision on targets he couldn't see. The moment when he understood that everything he thought he knew about warfare was wrong. March 1968. An American captain stood in a garage watching Australian soldiers saw the barrels off their rifles and laughed, "Those idiots won't last a week." 6 days later, he wasn't laughing. He was screaming into a radio, watching his company being destroyed, begging for help from the idiots he'd mocked. And when those idiots arrived, smelling like rot, wearing enemy sandals, carrying sawed-off rifles, they didn't charge in with American firepower and aggression. They infiltrated through 200 enemy fighters at 100 meters per hour, called precision artillery from inside Viet Cong lines, and reversed a battle that American doctrine couldn't win. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The Pentagon called their methods primitive. The 118 paratroopers who survived Long Tan called them something else entirely. They called them the reason they were still alive. 1 to 500. That wasn't luck, not favorable terrain, not statistical anomaly. That was what happened when soldiers stopped smelling like Americans and started smelling like the jungle. When they stopped moving like Americans and started moving like shadows. When they stopped fighting like Americans and started fighting like ghosts. The Pentagon knew the numbers. They classified them. The enemy knew the numbers. They feared them. The survivors knew the numbers. They owed their lives to them. The arithmetic of patience over firepower. The mathematics of adaptation over technology. The calculus of becoming what the jungle required, rather than demanding the jungle accommodate what you preferred to be. The Australians solved the problem in 1966. The Americans took decades to learn from their solution. Some would argue they still haven't fully learned. That is their legacy. That is what they proved. That is what they left behind for anyone willing to learn. If this story of the jungle ghosts, who proved everyone wrong, moved you, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. We're uncovering more Vietnam War stories about the tactics that actually worked, the soldiers who were dismissed as primitives until they saved lives, and the lessons that were too embarrassing for institutions to admit. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have had the discipline to move at 100 meters per hour, knowing your allies were dying 2 kilometers away? Would you have stopped bathing for weeks to become invisible? And share this with anyone who needs to understand that sometimes the simplest methods, patience, adaptation, respect for your enemy, outperform all the technology in the world. Thanks for watching, and remember, the Australian SAS didn't win by being louder or faster or more aggressive. They won by becoming ghosts. Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, 1 to 500.